Up until a couple weeks ago, I'd never played the original Final Fantasy VII. Of course, I knew stuff about it. I knew there's a character who dies. I knew there's music that goes like, and I knew about the opening shot. Because even though I had no idea about the broader context of the story, this is electric. And then I played 2020's Final Fantasy VII Remake, and suddenly my obsession with the original's opening shot makes complete sense to me. Welcome to Midgar, home to 1,000 soldiers, 1,000,000 XP points, and 1,000,000,000 tons of steel. Welcome to the Great Rotting Pizza, the most literal manifestation of structural inequity ever put in a game. Welcome to my favorite video game setting in years. In the original game, the first thing you see is Aerith's face, but in the remake, the first thing you see is infrastructure. Actually, I take that back. In the remake, the first thing you see is the consequences of infrastructure. A bird flies over miles of barren land, blasted clean like the surface of a planet without an atmosphere. It just keeps going. Nothing, and then in the distance, not clouds, but smog. And then steel beams reach out like grasping tendrils in the haze, and then we're suddenly surrounded by it. An almost overwhelming amount of detail, skyscrapers and trains and highways and people. And the music is about as ominous as it possibly could be about the whole thing. A group of kids play on a playground until they're struck silent by a reactor in the distance. It took me a couple times to understand those opening seconds of this scene. That desert, that barren expanse, it's not that Midgar was, for some reason, built in the middle of a wasteland. It's that before we even see what Mako power has accomplished, we see its cost. We see, as Barrett would say, that the world is being sucked dry. But then, almost as quickly, we're in it. And that outside world is replaced in our memories by the absolute density of modernity here. For a game called Final Fantasy, these buildings don't have much fantasy within them. But they are fantastic, aren't they? We go from an empty world to a gleaming one with trains and skyscrapers and cars, and it's all so much that I almost forget there are any costs at all. And then that reactor goes off and reminds me all over again. There's this near sublime feeling that comes from just these very opening scenes of wonder and horror inextricably mixed with each other. There's only a few games I can think of that have come close to it, and I've already said a few thousand words on one of them. But what's fascinating about Midgar, and what you're well aware of if you've played even a little of the game, is that all this is just half the city, and far less than half the story. Everything we're seeing here is on top of the plate, a giant metal disc that all these skyscrapers, train tracks, and power plants are built on. But we spend most of our time below the plate, in the slums of Midgar's Undercity. Because Midgar is a... Can I show you my favorite part of Final Fantasy VII Remake? It's this, right here. There's nothing that happens, really. It's not the fantastic combat system or Tifa Lockhart or this part where Cloud hits his sword on a door frame. It's just opening the door onto this vista and seeing the immensity of the plate above you, how much it dominates everything below. It is terrifying. Like somehow living immediately below the Death Star. It's also beautiful, though. I mean, the lighting of this scene alone is just so unexpected. To be blasted with natural light after hours of darkness and artificial illumination. Like I said in my Mirror's Edge video, I feel like I know what temperature this scene is, how welcome the warmth from the sun must feel. That beauty is also temporary, though. Because even as I looked up and appreciated the light, I could see the construction happening over the scant openings that were letting it through. The light was a bug, not a feature. Soon enough, the entire underside would be sealed up and live in the dark. Because, of course, people aren't evenly distributed in Midgar. Rich people live up, poor people live down. It's not a new idea. In fact, it's a terribly well-trodden one, from the mansions and basements of Parasite to the sci-fi towers and alleys of Blade Runner to, like, real life. You know. One of my favorite instances of this is also one of the most obviously named, Akira Kurosawa's 1963 film High and Low, which plays out its central conflict through elevation. Toshiro Mifune as a rich and powerful businessman living high on a hill, being forced to face the violence inherent in his position. But just because Midgar isn't novel doesn't mean that the metaphor isn't powerful. One of the constants in these stories is how elevation, and thus class, asserts who is given humanity and who has to fight for it. In High and Low, Mifune literally looks down on the working class out of his enormous windows in his elevated mansion, and only actually considers them when one threatens his status. In Parasite, the Park family view the poor as interchangeable at best and literal monsters at worst, oblivious to the suffering they're complicit in up until the very end. And in Midgar, the story starts with it's an assertion from the main cast that although they live under the plate, they refuse to be sealed over and forgotten about. On the plate, your right to exist is a given. Beneath, it has to be clawed to, inch by inch. Due to the design of Midgar, residents of the underside are constantly reminded of their position. The steel sky is the limit. They can go no higher. Imagine how psychologically devastating it would be to see this ceiling all day, every day, and know that there were countless structures in place to keep you beneath it. By contrast, those lucky enough to live above the plate are never reminded that the bottom side even exists. On top of Midgar, the people who live underneath you might as well be a myth. They're so out of sight, out of mind. At one point, you visit a Midgar museum, one that includes a 1/10,000th scale model of the city, and that model literally doesn't even include the bottom half. Half of the population wiped out of perceived existence. What the game does so well is making you confront all of the city, the top and the bottom, the gleaming towers and the decrepit scaffolding. You don't stick to the main streets in Final Fantasy VII, not even close. You will sidle along rusting edges, stride through million-dollar lobbies, race along empty highways. The game refuses to make Midgar an abstract concept. Through your constant conflict with its infrastructure, you are forced to reckon with its omnipresence. Once in Edinburgh, Scotland, I went on a tour of Mary King's Close. It was a lovely little ghost tour, but what I found most fascinating and most haunting was what Mary King's Close itself was. Edinburgh was built on many hills, and around 1500, the incredibly dense construction of the place meant that buildings went down as much as they went up, sometimes 10 or more stories due to their layers and layers of basements. These basements were, to put it lightly, hellish. They were small, smoky, cold, crowded, not particularly waterproof, downhill from everyone throwing their chamber pots out the window. Would you like me to go on? No? Alright. As you can imagine, these basements weren't particularly desirable living conditions, and so they were always filled by the poorest and most socially immobile residents. And one day, Edinburgh decided that it wanted to move beyond the misery that was inherent in these many basemented streets. They did so by simply building on top of them. Mary King's Close, the tour I took, was a series of alleys and rooms that had, of all things, the Edinburgh City Chambers built directly on top of them. Theoretically, this was meant to drive all the inhabitants out of the Close. In practice, demanding that the least socially mobile parts of your society up and move is a losing proposition. In practice, people remained almost entirely sealed off from the surface for far longer than planned. And I'm not talking months or even years here, but decades. The city chambers were built in 1760, and the last family left the close in 1902. More than 100 years of living and working underground, while the city council met directly overhead. Any book written about the underground communities of Edinburgh, any ghost tour you take, lingers on how absolutely wretched the conditions were under the street. I guarantee you, your guide will give you a whole spiel on what people would yell as they were throwing their piss and poop onto the street, and what you were supposed to yell if you didn't want to be covered in said piss and poop. They'll agonize over how the plague tore through the community, and how bitterly cold it was during the winter, and all this is true, of course. But I sometimes feel like these descriptions veer into misery porn, that we're all there to just gawk at how awful someone's life could be. It's the same with many fictional depictions of that high-low divide. It's a challenging thing to do, to accurately show all the struggles of poverty, all the ways people are denied their humanity, without making the whole thing a zoo, to stand outside and go, could you imagine being poor? And this actually gets back to what I adore about Midgar, because even though we see how inequality manifests on a daily basis, it doesn't feel like the game is spent wallowing in misery. On the contrary, Final Fantasy VII often goes out of its way to show how people are existing and finding joy amid trying circumstances. Everything from food stands and incredibly detailed little farmers markets, to the clear pride Tifa takes in her ability to make an admittedly weird colored cocktail, to this lavishly animated dance these two kids are doing on a rooftop. Like, look how much detail there is here. Look at how expressive they are. There is no gameplay purpose to this dance, nothing to take from it, except this beautiful feeling of life amidst hardship. This is backed up by the actual environment as well. There's this moment when you first see Aerith's house, and Cloud vocalizes some extremely out-of-character enthusiasm.
There you go. That's my house.
It's amazing.
That enthusiasm really makes sense here, though. It is amazing. The amount of life that's been brought back from this barren rock they were given is such a wonderful... for this community that's determined to show their humanity no matter what. As for why Aerith's house is this big and she has so much land while everyone else lives in shacks, I don't know. There are flowers, there's nature, there's water that's almost certainly irradiated with some kind of Mako runoff, but it is still a place with created beauty, despite the best efforts of the elite to shut them down. Simultaneously, though, what this game does so well is not settling for some blasé moral about the indomitable spirit of the poor, because as much as they can and do make for themselves, you can't good spirits your way out of the oppression that comes from being a literal underclass, and the game doesn't pretend they should. Remember what I said it started with? In Final Fantasy VII, the explanation we get for the unethicalness of the power plants that literally encircle the city is a good catch-all type reason. They are sucking the life out of the planet. But when I see these images of the exhaust from these reactors being shot into the air, when I see the proximity of working adults and animals and children to them, it's not the overarching planetary costs that come to mind. It's the intimately human ones. There is a stretch of the Texas Gulf Coast that has not one, not two, but 6 oil refineries that share a rather dubious distinction. They each emit more of a chemical called benzene than almost anywhere else in the country. Benzene is a colorless liquid that evaporates very quickly. It's used to make motor fuels, plastics, detergents, pesticides. It's kind of everywhere, and I can basically guarantee you've been exposed to a little benzene. Unless you live on that stretch of the Texas Gulf Coast, then chances are you've been exposed to significantly more than a little. Our normal exposure to benzene comes in trace amounts from car exhaust, gas stations, cigarette smoke, forest fires, Things that, if you're forced to spend too long around, you kind of get the sense that maybe it's not great that I've been breathing this for so long. If you live in Port Arthur, Texas, however, your main exposure site is going to be from the Total Petrochemicals refinery. It's an oil refinery that kicks out about 180,000 barrels of crude oil a day. It's been refining oil since 1936, and it takes up a huge amount of land on Port Arthur's edge. There's a certain level of benzene in the air that the EPA considers actionable. That is, a concentration that should be investigated, a concentration that's cause for concern. At the fence line of the Total Chemicals refinery, the amount of benzene was 148% of that level. And what's just beyond the refinery's fence line? Well, take a guess. Port Arthur's poverty in 2017 was triple the national average. The majority of people who live there are black or brown, the median household income is about $30,000, and the lung cancer death rate is off the fucking charts. If you live in Port Arthur, you're more than 50% more likely to die of lung cancer than the US average, and 3 to 6 times more likely to suffer from respiratory, nervous system, skin, and cardiovascular illnesses.
People are living at or below the poverty line, right next to so much wealth. Yet we have to bear the brunt of the toxic waste that's emitted from these facilities.
This is what I mean when I say you can't good spirits yourself out of being crushed by the upper class. No matter how hard you work to beautify yourself and your immediate surroundings, there are some ways that being poor is just a fucking death sentence. And that, shockingly enough, is why I ended up loving Midgar as much as I did, because it demonstrates both the humanity that cannot be taken by the elite and the ways that this kind of class structure necessitates fighting back. It is a hellish manifestation of institutional power, but it is also beautiful and hopeful and exploding with spirit. Midgar is not a model of city we should aspire to. In many ways, we're kind of already there. But I still find the life of this place remarkable, its grasp of the grand and the intimate equally impressive. The best thing I can say about it is after spending far too many hours wandering amidst its streets, I still get the same feeling I had when first seeing that pullback years and years ago. I still feel that electricity.